I'd firstly like to congratulate the conference organizers because I've never had a Japanese meal in the middle of the conference, not since 1987, since I did public addresses. And it's all about doing something first, and this is a first. I'd like to do three things for you this morning. I'd like to go through the methodology that I've devised with a young woman called Chantal Ilbery on how to look at the future. We've developed it into a schools program. We're teaching the program in London and also here in South Africa. Schools in Johannesburg using it are St. John's, Rodine, St. David's, in Cape Town, Somerset College, in Natal, Durban Girls College. And we're doing it at a private girls' school in North London. And we call it Growing Foxes, and it's based on the principles of a book that we wrote in 2001 called The Mind of a Fox. And I'd like to go through those principles, share them with you, so that the next time you have a conversation about the future, you can think of using this technique because it's very simple. And then secondly, I'd like to go through the global economy, and Nick is quite right. I share a lot of points with Davi on that. And thirdly, look at South Africa and the possibilities for South Africa. I guess the story starts in the year 2000. I was, at that time, still in Anglo. We'd used scenario planning during the 1980s to develop political scenarios for South Africa. We called them the high road and low road, and they were quite popular because it did persuade people here that the only high road was to negotiate a constitutional settlement with the real leaders of South Africa. But what was a real tragedy was that when our consultant, a wonderful Frenchman called Pierre Wack, retired in 1993 from Anglo, the whole process of scenario planning, which he had used at Royal Dutch Shell, came to a halt. And Chantal sent me her thesis, which she was doing at the Graduate School of Business in Cape Town, on scenario planning for small business. And it was so good that I said we must collaborate and write a book together. It took us 5 months. We published it in June 2001, and we called it The Mind of a Fox. And it's based on another book called from Isaiah Berlin, who was a professor at Oxford during the 50s and 60s, and he called his book The Hedgehog and the Fox. And it was all about a poet who in 650 BC, his name was Archilochus, wrote the following line: "The hedgehog knows one big thing, whereas the fox knows many little things." And obviously, we naturally said scenario planners who look at multiple futures are foxes, whereas a hedgehog will basically project a single future, make all his plans around that single future, reject all other futures, and go for it. And sometimes you have sensationally successful hedgehogs because of the focus that they bring to what they're doing. But it's a very high-stakes strategy because if you get the future wrong, you can lose everything. So we called it The Mind of a Fox. But there were two other aspects which we were trying to get across with that title. Firstly, foxes have very bright eyes, much brighter than dogs, and they can pick up changes in the environment quicker than other animals. And secondly, they have the agility to respond to those changes, which allows them to get out of trouble much more quickly and obviously pounce on any opportunities. And we feel that that is exactly what business is about. You've got to be there ahead of the crowd. It's not about having prophetic qualities about the future. I mean, there may be some people in this world who do. It's just about having a kind of method to check out the future that allows you to arrive at judgments ahead of your competitors. And so what we've persuaded people to do since we wrote the book is to look at the flags, the drivers that are changing the future. And Davi, in the last part of his presentation, came up with an absolutely critical flag on blockchains. And you've then got to obviously look at the narrative that flows out of the flag. What are the possible scenarios for my industry, whether it's banking, whether it's retail? What is the scenario that is relevant for me that flows out of that particular flag? And then obviously you've got to say, what are the strategy and tactics that I am going to do now in order to take advantage of the flag or possibly counter the threats? When the book first came out, it wasn't that successful because books on scenario planning seldom are, but then something happened which turned it into an overnight hit. It was the best-selling book of any title in South Africa in 2002. And in 2003 it was number 2 because Harry Potter was number 1. So what was the event? It was 9/11, because what we did was publish a letter to George Bush in the book to illustrate the power of our technique. And we said in our letter that if he wanted to leave his legacy as American president, he'd have to think like a fox. And therefore, he had to look at the flags that were rising to see whether they constituted opportunities or threats. And we said in the book that his biggest threat was a massive terrorist strike on a western city, which would totally turn his presidential term upside down and possibly lead America into a gilded cage where they shut themselves off from the rest of the world. And it happened 3 months after we published the book with 9/11. And when the Americans did a literature search, they found that ours was the only book published anywhere in the world in 2001 that in a formal letter, so it wasn't fiction, a formal letter said, "This is your biggest threat." Why do I know that? Because about 6 months after 9/11, I was rung up by somebody in the US State Department. So I was for a short time a person of interest, and asked, why did you write this letter? So I said, because we were illustrating our technique of being a fox, and we had 3 flags, which we felt made this event more probable in America. Number 1 was the growing confrontation between the major religions of the world, particularly Christianity and Islam, which really started in the late 1980s. The second was the growing sophistication of terrorist organizations in places like Afghanistan in the 90s. But the flag that really made us feel that this was imminent was the 2 attacks by Al-Qaeda on American embassies in Africa, one in Tanzania and one in Kenya in 1998, which we felt was a dress rehearsal for the real thing in America. And we've always thought that if we'd been allowed to provide these flags and scenarios to the American intelligence agencies, they might have picked up on some of the significant flags that they got before the event, which we knew nothing about. Came out in the congressional inquiry after 9/11 that there was a young woman in the FBI who went to her boss on 6 occasions and said, "Boss, there's a flying school down the road where Arabs are learning to take off but not land." Big clue. But it was ignored on the grounds that Arabs were too incompetent to attack Americans on American soil, which is precisely the kind of judgment that you interrogate if you're a fox by offering alternative scenarios and flags. And so overnight we became quite big celebrities. Our website, mindofafox.com, became incredibly popular in America, and to this day we do work there. We work in Europe quite a lot, and I'm still doing quite a lot of work in South Africa, but it's the schools program which we've really enjoyed setting up, where we're teaching kids how to identify the flags that are of interest to them, and then working out the scenarios that flow out of the flags, and then deciding what the best strategy and tactics to adopt are. And we're asking them to do 3 exercises, one around the future of the planet, because young people actually are far more interested in the long-term future of the planet than adults. They do see dangers. The second is the future of their school, and it's quite interesting how they see the difference between a school in 20 years' time to the teachers who are teaching them. And the third is we ask them to do the technique on themselves and then helping them to decide what their future careers might be. So, what are the flags that our global clients have raised with us over the last 5 years, which they see as significant game changers in the world? Well, sadly, the religious flag is still discussed, particularly by some of our clients in the Middle East, and particularly oil companies. Because ever since 9/11, unfortunately, the world has become a more polarized place. And you know, we've seen it with the opening of the U.S. embassy in Jerusalem and the tragedy that occurred in the loss of life for Palestinians. We see it in Syria all the time. We've seen it in Yemen. And you have to say that the Middle East at the moment is in the darkest space that it's been for a very, very long time. And yes, obviously, and it's the one point we've made, is that if any of the combatants get hold of nuclear weapons, this will absolutely change things overnight. And it's obviously a reason that Trump decided to remove America from the Iran deal. But that in itself is possibly going to lead to consequences that he simply hasn't anticipated and are completely outside his control. So it's just added to the risk of the Middle East. The second flag that people raise is the red flag of China rising. The latest UN forecast is that China is going to overtake America to become the largest economy in the world by the mid-2030s. So just as the 19th century belonged to Britain and the 20th century belonged to America, the 21st century ultimately will belong to China. And as Davy quite rightly said, it's a very good bonus for South Africa that we belong to BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and ourselves, because China is the country of the future. And indeed, some schools in South Africa are beginning to teach Mandarin. So, yes, it is a flag. It's a long-term flag for this century because it is going to change the game, because we haven't had a kind of number one economy in the world since 1700, because China, funnily enough, was number one in 1700, so they're going back to number one again. But we're used to English-speaking number ones, and that's going to change. The third flag is, I'm surprised more people don't talk about it. It's the grey flag of the aging of the world's population. One statistic, in 1900, the average lifespan of an American was 42 years. And of course, there was a lot of infant mortality in those days to bring down the average, but nevertheless, 42. In 2000, it was 83 for men, 86 for women. So you can say that medical advances more or less doubled our lifespans in 1 century. And that has led to some incredible changes in society. In America, all the baby boomers are now geriatric boomers. And somebody has to keep them alive. And you've got Medicare, Medicaid. And yes, Trump shouldn't mess around with those, because they're becoming increasingly vital. In the UK, national health is in a permanent state of crisis, because when old people go into hospital, they never come out. They take the bed and they stay in it. And yeah, there's a constant shortage of beds in many of the state hospitals in the UK. But the most important influence of this flag is what it is doing to Japan and Europe, because Japan is the oldest society in the world, has the highest percentage of people over 65. And if you remember back to the 70s and 80s, we all wanted to be Japanese because their economy was growing at 7 or 8% per annum. They had a property crash in 1990, and they've never grown since. And there's a very good reason. Old people don't eat as much. They don't do anything as much. And so Japan has introduced a new economic model, which is you have a flat economy with a declining population. And so your income per head rises. Europe is going exactly the same way. Europe is an aging population. And so this flag is the one reason I've said to people, you must invest in America if you're going to put your money overseas, because America is going to do much better than Europe and Japan, because it's a relatively young nation, even though it's got more and more old people. It's more resilient, and it's going to grow faster economically than the other two. And I've been proved absolutely right. I mean, in 1999, the Dow Jones Industrial Average was 11,700 at its peak. It's now 25,000. So it's more than double what it was in 1999. The FTSE 100 peaked at 6,500 in 1999. It's now 7,800. And yeah, so it's gone up, but it hasn't gone up by anything like the US. And I think it's largely due to the fact that America has a younger population because of more generous immigration and other reasons. The fourth flag, again, Darby referred to, we call it the anti-establishment flag. It's this wave of populism around the world because people are increasingly angry that the super rich and the political establishment are taking over this world, and they want to fire back. And the only way they can fire back is through their votes. Hence Brexit. Brexit essentially was the north of England voting against the south of England. Up yours. And that was it. Overnight, Theresa May somehow has to put it into place. Donald Trump. I mean, you know, the odds given on him actually winning the election, even on election day, were pretty remote, but he did it. And in Europe, you're now getting all these populist movements, the most recent one being in Italy, where a professor who's never been in politics before has just been elected leader of one of the parties. So it is it's what we call a very cloudy flag, because we don't know where it's going, and you have to play a considerable range of scenarios to kind of figure out what the ultimate impact of this particular flag is. The last flag is climate change, which, you know, I did a session with probably some of the best climate experts in the world in 2006 in London, and they gave a 95% probability to their theory being correct, that the warming of the world is linked to man-made carbon emissions. And yeah, we are now in this century where there could be real repercussions of a warming climate, particularly much more extreme weather patterns, extreme rainfalls, extreme droughts. And of course that will have an impact on the insurance industry, it will have an impact on lots of other industries as well. In the Western Cape, we're not sure whether our weather patterns are going to be permanently changed by the fact that the mixture of highs and lows in the middle of the Atlantic have moved further south. What's happening is that the highs are pushing the lows further south, and therefore the kind of stormy weather that we used to get in the Western Cape is now going south. That is a hypothesis that is being put forward. We don't know what the probability of it being correct is, but obviously we have to think that we may be in a permanent drought, in which case we're going to have to build a huge desalination plant to help Cape Town's water supply. The global scenarios, therefore, I have two. One is really just continuing moderate rate of growth because of the fact that Japan and Europe have fairly flat economic growth rates, and they represent such a large chunk of the global economy. America will do better, continue to do better than either of those two. So the world economy can plod along at a moderate growth rate, with obviously China ahead at around 5 to 6%, some African countries doing even better than that. That's the kind of mainframe scenario. But the other scenario, and again, Darby picked up on it, is where the oil price, because of the disruption caused by Trump walking out of the Iraq deal, but for other reasons as well, the oil price really has another real escalation, maybe to beyond $100 a barrel. And that has to ignite inflation in the United States. And with higher inflation rates, interest rates will have to rise faster than the Federal Reserve anticipates. And of course, there's a lot of debt out there because we've had easy money since the financial crash of 2007 and 8. We have governments up to their shoulders in debt. We have obviously individual households and companies. And if you suddenly double the rate of interest, you might then, similar to 2007, start getting defaults. And then you have a scenario called fork lightning. We call it fork lightning because lightning always strikes more than once. We had the first strike in 2007 and 8, and we could have a second strike next year. We've upped the probability of that scenario from 10% to 20%. So it's not a sort of mainframe scenario, but you have to watch the oil price, you have to watch the US inflation rate, and you have to watch the 10-year American bond rate. Those are the three flags that we feel people should watch very closely now, because they will give you an indication of whether there's going to be another crash. South Africa, well, the local CEOs have raised 6 flags in the conversations that we facilitate. Number 1, corruption. Because they see the end game of corruption as Venezuela. And I know the president has just been re-elected, but it is pitiful life for Venezuelans. They're even walking over the border to get food. It's dreadful how they're sort of picking through rubbish and doing everything else because they're just trying to survive. And Venezuela is a rich country. It's got a lot of oil still. But yeah, that's what happens as the end game of corruption. In South Africa, I've always regarded this flag as pinkish, not red, because we have an incredibly strong media, which has obviously exposed a lot of the activities of the Guptas and others. So we've had a lot of pushback. And indeed, I thought the results of the last municipal election in South Africa was an indication that the public is fed up with corruption. And in many ways, what's going on in Northwest Province right now is an indication of what people feel about corruption. I think that the slim victory of Cyril Ramaphosa in the ANC election was due to this flag. And obviously, he's now putting a lot of effort into trying to bring this flag down. And good luck to him. We don't know yet whether he's going to be able to do it, but at least his heart is in the right place. I mean, I used to negotiate a lot with Cyril when I was the CEO of Anglo's Gold Division, and he was the General Secretary of the National Union of Mine Workers. And I have to say, whenever we reached a settlement, he stuck to it. He never ratted on a single deal. So I have a lot of time for Cyril and his wife, Dr. Motsepe. And I really hope that he can prevail in a very tricky situation where he's trying to weigh his options in a fairly divided party. The second flag is around quality of infrastructure, because a lot of CEOs here feel that you can't grow an economy at 3% per annum without quality of infrastructure, and certainly without quality of education, which is a sort of invisible part of the infrastructure. I understand this flag because in 2006, I was asked by the Central Party School, which is the inner sanctum of the Chinese Communist Party, to show them how scenario planning works so that they could road test their 5-year economic plans, which the school actually develops for China. And after we'd done the session, I was asked to look around the school because very few foreigners actually visit that school. And what really struck me was that in every classroom they'd taken down the slogans of Chairman Mao and replaced them with slogans of Deng Xiaoping. So even though Mao's portrait still hangs in Tiananmen Square, the spiritual leader of the Chinese Communist Party is Deng. It's no longer Mao. And I said to one of the professors, why? He said, well, in 1978, when Deng succeeded Mao, we were the 100th ranked economy in the world. We're now number 5, and of course now they're number 2. And he said it was because Deng put emphasis on 2 things. Quality of infrastructure in China, roads, bridges, airports, and all that kind of stuff. And the second thing was creation of wealth by companies and individuals, whether it was foreigners or whether it was local Chinese, all obviously underneath the Communist Party umbrella. And yeah, I think the same applies here, and it's why Pravin Gordon's current job is so important, because we really have to turn around our state-owned enterprises to create the kind of platform that we need for that 3 to 5% economic growth rate. At one session recently, a CEO said in South Africa, in parts of it anyway, you don't drive on the left of the road, you drive on what's left of the road. So that was fairly negative. The third flag that people raise is style of leadership, because it is important. I mean, Mandela was incredible. I mean, he really had an amazing ability to bring this country together. Thabo Mbeki was okay, but he certainly wasn't as good as Mandela. But I'm afraid to say, Jacob Zuma, we started becoming very divided again, particularly when he hired Bell Pottinger. And so, yeah, we are a divided society. So one of the principal flags to watch is whether Cyril, in his style of leadership, is going to start to bring us all together again, so that we can act as a team in taking on the rest of the world. I always said one of my great heroes, even though I'm a Chelsea supporter, is Alex Ferguson. I was very sorry that he went into hospital the other day. But the great thing about Alex Ferguson was that he kept Manchester United united. He even threw hairdryers at David Beckham when he got stroppy. And he kept everybody together, and they won a record number of trophies. As soon as he left, they've won nothing. And they got beaten by Chelsea last weekend. So, yeah, in the FA Cup final. The fuck up, as somebody calls it. You definitely need a unifying leadership style. It's an important flag to watch. The fourth one they raise is around pockets of excellence. The fact is South Africa has incredible pockets of excellence. I mean, here in Hyde Park Shopping Centre, you have a pocket of excellence. Most people with money, it's a sad thing to say with money, have a life as good as any life you can live in America, the UK, or anywhere else in the world. Obviously, we've got the challenge to give many more people access to that kind of life. But it's because a lot of our companies are genuinely world-class in this country. They're still world-class. And we mustn't dumb them down. We've obviously got to replicate their excellence, and that is a very important flag. The second last flag for me is the most important one of all, and it is to do with the changing nature of work. I mean, work today for young people is completely different to work in the last century. In the last century, my era, you just got, because I was brought up in the UK, good A-levels, you got a good university degree, you waved your CV in front of big companies, you got a job. That was the standard way that young people went. But because of artificial intelligence, robots, and automation and all that kind of stuff, most young people today have to create a job rather than get a job. And it is a huge change. It's almost as big as the blockchain. It is huge. Have any schools actually adapted their curriculums as a result of this enormous change? The answer is no. They're still teaching kids to get good matrics, to go to university, to get degrees, and then go into things. And yes, a lot of them will succeed in a conventional sense. But hundreds of thousands of children will not succeed. And I think it's one of the reasons that our Growing Foxes program has been very well received by the young people at a school, because they've never been taught to think in an entrepreneurial way about the future. I mean, the bottom line is you want to create 5 million jobs in South Africa, you're going to have to create 1 million new businesses. And Cyril shouldn't actually have a job summit. He should have an enterprise summit, because we've got to completely turn our economy upside down to generate real economic freedom for ordinary entrepreneurs. I actually shared a platform with Julius Malema where we had a debate in Cape Town. In fact, it's the only real hit I've ever had on YouTube. I think we've had 650,000 visits. So you just got to have click in Malema versus Sunter, and you'll get our debate, which we did 2 years ago. And I said to him, I'm just as much of an economic freedom fighter as you, Julius. It's just that I have different tactics. You want to nationalize the banks and the mines, take over the land. I don't think that's going to work. I feel that we've got to really look at the economy and transform it, because sadly we are still in a state of economic apartheid. We've got rid of a political apartheid. We haven't got rid of economic apartheid. I do enough work in the townships around Cape Town to know that if you're a good young entrepreneur in Khayelitsha or Langa or Gugulethu, you've got very little chance of getting into the mainstream economy in Cape Town. And we've got to change that. We've absolutely got to change that. We've got to bring down the walls. We've got to turn a siloed economy dominated by big business into a really open economy. I remember Bruce Whitfield wrote an article after he'd been to the Berkshire Hathaway AGM and in Omaha. And one of the things he said was that when he talked to the taxi driver, the guy serving at the bar, all of them had 3 jobs. They were little businesses, and they did 3 things during the day to earn money. And that's why I think the American unemployment rate now sits at around 4%, as opposed to 8 to 10% in Europe, is that naturally a lot of Americans are entrepreneurs in their own way. And we've got to do something about it. I personally think that every big business in this country should dedicate 20% of their supply chain to nurturing small business. I think the banks should get together to come up with an equivalent of the Grameen Bank in Bangladesh, where you lend money to micro-enterprise. Because you talk to most banks, they say the administrative cost of a loan rules out credit to micro businesses, so we've got to find a way around that. I think we should have a sort of e-stock exchanges in each major city where you can actually float your business on the stock exchange, tell people that they can come around and look at it. So you use crowdfunding to support your business. I think there's a whole bunch of other things you can do, including changing the education system at schools. So we've got to have a serious debate about this, because the reality is we managed to negotiate the political crossroads successfully, but as our scenario team, the Anglo scenario team, said back in 1987, there's a second crossroads after the political crossroads, and that's the economic crossroads. And if you don't get that right, you won't stay on the high road. And that's exactly where we are right now. Which brings me to the last flag, land reform. It is the most incendiary flag, and in the worst case scenario, it could create a civil war in South Africa. You know, a lot of people play the Zimbabwe scenario. I play something worse than that, because you know, the Brits at the height of their military power on the Boers. And until Kitchener came in with ruthless tactics, they were losing the war. Kitchener started concentration camps. Everybody thinks Hitler started concentration camps. He didn't. Kitchener started concentration camps, and he killed 25,000 women and children in those camps. Certainly from disease. He didn't sort of put them in gas ovens or anything like that. But still, they died. And obviously, in the end, Britain won the war. But, you know, these guys are for real. And, you know, I feel very strongly that Cyril has got to do his very best to arrive at a sort of common understanding of how we do change land ownership in South Africa, because we've got to do it. I mean, there's no ways we can go on with the current pattern of land ownership. Personally, I think that, and I saw Max Dupré has posted an article today on News24 about this, that the first place we should start is land around the urban areas, because you know, that's where, to me, the worst kind of tragedy is, with everybody living in these dreadful squatter settlements under corrugated iron roofs. We've actually got to do much better than that Every time I come out of Cape Town Airport and drive to Somerset West, I get that terrible feeling as I look straight over at the sand dunes and think, what can life be like living in that individual shack on that sand dune? And we've got to do something about it. And I think that should be discussed. We've got to make open municipal land available. We've got to expropriate private land around the urban areas. And 2/3 of the South African population is urbanized. And that's why the initial land invasions that we've had since Cyril raised the flag have been in urban areas. Nobody's tried to invade a farm yet in the middle of the Free State. And so, you know, we've got to tackle this flag, but we've got to tackle it in a way that brings us together in terms of a solution rather than dividing us. Just one small story to give you hope. I did a session about 6 years ago with the largest dairy farmer in South Africa. His name is Trevor Elliott. He has a dairy farm in Nature's Valley, and he has 14,000 cows, which is triple what a normal farmer has. So he's by far the largest dairy farmer in South Africa. And he came to the conclusion that he had to do something about the ownership. So he bought the adjoining farm. He put it into an employees' trust. And all the methods which he adopted from New Zealand, because New Zealand is the #1 dairy farming country in the world, he put into this farm. It's actually run by the employees. And now guess what? That farm is the second largest dairy farm in South Africa. So it can be done. But that's what we've got to do. Because it is a very, very fiery flag, this one. And we've got to do everything to keep it down. So given these flags, what are the scenarios we play for South Africa, Chantal and I? 3. Premier League, where we stay in the Premier League of Nations. We have been the #1 economy in Africa since 1850 with the discovery of diamonds. We want to keep it that way. Egypt and Nigeria are getting close. So this scenario envisages Cyril's new dawn materializing, that his leadership really does start changing things, and we basically turn around the dreadful trend of failure of economic growth of the last 5 to 6 years, and we get back to the kind of 3% plus economic growth rate in South Africa. The second scenario is where we don't do that. The forces beyond Cyril's control, which have let us down, overwhelm him, and we just slide into the second division. We get relegated from the Premier League. And it's not that there's going to be a huge war in South Africa, we just slide down. The third scenario is the one which is scary. We call it failed state. It's where the level of public violence rises to a level that we're put on the same par, or put on a par with Syria, with Somalia, with Yemen, where people won't even think of investing because of physical risk. Before the Cyril's election as leader of the ANC, we were giving a 30% probability to Premier League, a 60% probability to second division, and a 10% probability to failed state. Now that Cyril's become president, we've reversed the first two probabilities. We give 60% to Premier League, 30% to second division, and we retain failed state as a wildcard scenario at 10%. I'd like to end with one story before we have our panel, just to leave you on a high. I was the chairman of the Anglo-American Scholarship Panel for 25 years, and we interviewed the brightest students in South Africa for one open scholarship to university. And in 2008, we interviewed the brightest student we ever had in front of our panel. He was just 17 years old. He got 8 straight A's in matric when he was 16. Got a scholarship to St. John's College when he was 15. He comes from Umtata, and his name is Siyobelela Zuza. And the question we put to him is, what degree have you chosen and why? He said, I've chosen chemical engineering at UCT. And the reason is I developed this passion for chemicals when I was 12 years old. I started mixing them in my mother's kitchen, causing minor explosions to our utter dismay. And then I focused on a project, which was to create a rocket fuel that was more energy intensive than the stuff NASA uses to send its rockets into space. It took me 2 years. I cracked the formula. I assembled a South African team. We built a rocket. I put in my fuel, and we beat the South African amateur altitude record. This project came to the attention of NASA. They asked me to send them a sample of my fuel, and they named a minor planet after me. I mean, how many of you in this room know that a 17-year-old black South African had a minor planet named after him by NASA for the advances he's made to rocketry science? It's called the Siazusa planet. It's next to Jupiter. But the story doesn't end there. He comes rushing up to me at Oliver Tambo 3 weeks after we awarded him the scholarship and says, "Hey, Mr. Sunter, remember me?" I said, "Sia, I'm never going to forget you. How's UCT?" He says, "You haven't heard?" So I said, "No." He said, "Harvard University have given me a 4-year open scholarship to study chemical engineering there, all expenses paid, so you can have your scholarship back." And yeah, he did his 4 years. He did brilliantly in his exam results. But at the second last launch of the Endeavour space shuttle, he was the official guest of NASA and shown around the entire facility with 2 other guests, Barack and Michelle Obama. As a result of which, Michelle is one of his greatest fans and has been putting pressure on him to stay in America. But actually, he's back here and he's started an alternative energy company. Best of luck to him. But that's the kind of excellence that we have in South Africa, just waiting to be taken advantage of if we can create an open economy and get back into the middle of the Premier League. So I hope I've given you a feel for our model. It is very simple. There's nothing complicated. You're just looking at those game-changing flags. And as I said, Davy came up brilliantly with the Bitcoin flag or cryptocurrency flag and what it could do. And the successful foxes will be the guys who work out the consequences of that flag quicker than their competitors and adapt their strategy and tactics. So it's a simple technique. And obviously, the more cloudy a flag is, the more you have to play different scenarios to cover the best and the worst that can happen as a result of the flag. I've given you the global scenarios. So watch those 3 things: the US inflation rate, interest rates, the 10-year American bond yield, Treasury bond yield, and obviously you've got to watch the oil price to see whether we could have another crash. We give it, as I said, a 20% probability at the moment. Otherwise, the world is going to continue to grow at a modest rate. And lastly, South Africa. I put my faith in Cyril. I do think that he's a great guy. I do think that he can change things here. And that's why we give a 60% probability to moving back into the middle of the Premier League. And lastly, I'd like to leave you all with a benediction in this room, for whichever company you represent. May the fox be with you. Thank you.